Okay, y'all ready? Sorry for the delay. I started school this week. I have 6 classes. And when we scheduled these about 9 months in advance. At the time, we were doing Tuesday classes. Now we're doing Thursday class. So I have a class going on right now as we speak because I've had to subdivide my coursework because we weren't planning on Thursday night classes. So I teach the first 3 quarters, and then I have somebody else come in and finish up. So if I'm occasionally a few minutes late, it's because the traffic is against me coming from state all the way here for our Thursday night meetings. Next week it'll be no problem because we're not here. But just be patient. It takes a while. This machine is here because theirs is in repair. My car is in the shop with a new radiator needed, and I started school, and I now have to pay for daycare. It is an overwhelming experience to be a dad. Overwhelming. But welcome nonetheless. I want to look at something fascinating. I want to go backwards tonight. Okay? When the Magi came to him from Arabia and said that they knew from a star that appeared in the heavens that a king was born in your country and that they had come to worship him, King Herod learned from the elders of your people that it was written regarding Bethlehem in the prophet, you Bethlehem in the land of Judah are by no means least among the princes of Judah, for out of you will go forth a leader who will feed my people. Does that sound familiar? It certainly sounds pieced together from things we've read or things we've heard. This is Justin Martyr. This is the earliest framer of Western theology. Apart from those who followed, like Origen, nobody was more instrumental in preserving the New Testament text or the traditions of the apostles. Nobody. But look what he's saying about the birth of Jesus. This is written around 156, which is very early in Christian history. Accordingly, the Magi from Arabia came to Bethlehem, worshipped the child, and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This all sounds very familiar, doesn't it? But then did not return to Herod, since they were warned in a dream after worshiping the child in Bethlehem. Joseph, the spouse of Mary, who wished at first to divorce his betrothed Mary, supposing her to be pregnant through sexual relations with a man, was commanded in a vision not to divorce his wife. And an angel, now stop there for a moment. Still sounds familiar, doesn't it? Still sounds familiar. How much of this is from the New Testament? Why would he quote an entire passage from the Hebrew scripture if he's quoting the New Testament, which has it paraphrased? What does it say about Arabia in the New Testament? Nothing. It says they come from the east. The word doesn't even appear. It does here. Why does he call them magi? And why is he so boastful about the magi being there present? What do the magi have to do with Stoic philosophy? Because Justin is a Stoic philosopher. Well trained in Greek, well trained in rhetoric, certainly Platonic in thought. Notice it's the king that was born in your country, because this is a dialogue he does with a Jew named Trypho. So he's talking to Trypho using illustrations from the sources he's using in order to demonstrate that Jesus is the long-awaited Son of God. Comment? It's actually east. Anything east. You know, it's like saying the Badlands. Right. Oh, no, not at all. It's just anything in the east. It was just a slang term for everything not Jewish. There's the east out there, goes all the way through Parthia or Persia, that way, just that way, that away. And that's where the Magi are dwelling, in the east. No, a source that isn't New Testament. Well, let's go further and look. who appeared to him, informed him that what was in her womb was of the Holy Spirit. He then was afraid and did not divorce her, but on the occasion of their first census that was taken in Judea under Cyrenius, went up from Nazareth, where he lived, to Bethlehem, to which he belonged, to be enrolled. His family was of the tribe of Judah. Where's that in the New Testament? That inhabited that region. Along with Mary, he traveled. He was then ordered to proceed into Egypt and to remain there with the child until another revelation warned them to return to Judea. Now, when the child was born in Bethlehem, since Joseph could not find lodging in that village, he took up his quarters in a particular cave. Where's that in the New Testament? He's quoting it equally to what you'd see in Matthew or Luke. He's not giving it any less authority. That means he's not using Matthew or Luke at all. In fact, he describes it as the memoirs of the apostles. Justin doesn't say he's quoting Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or John. He wouldn't certainly quote John. Justin wants nothing to do with the Gospel of John. But he certainly is quoting a source that he thinks is apostolic, that contains data here not found in our New Testament. So what's he quoting? Let's continue. In a particular cave that he finds near that village, and while they were there, Mary brought forth the Christ and placed him in a manger. Why is there a manger in a cave?
Because that was a common place for them to add animals in.
Then why would he call it a cave? They didn't keep sheep and goats and stuff in a cave because they kept them out in the fields.
They could keep them in the house too.
Yeah, but those are you couldn't keep 5,000 of them, but you could keep the pets, family pets. But they didn't keep the whole flock. That'd be hundreds and hundreds of sheep in your house.
They could keep some of the domestic animals.
Yeah, but you're not. But David lived with the flock. He was out with the flock. He was a child that was hidden from public.
I didn't know much about the weather or that sort of thing in the Holy Land, but would they typically, like, say in Europe, where they'll put animals under the houses to get the body heat to when
Not in Israel. Not at this time. In fact, the only time you're brought in is to be sheared or to be killed. You live in the fields. No. What's interesting, if the snow level is 200 feet below where Bethlehem is. So, yeah, but not often. It happens here too, but it doesn't happen very often. It's 200 feet below the snow level where Jesus was born. My point is, not even snow or any of that. The shepherds are out in the fields. They're living with, this is the middle of the night, the angel appears. They don't go to the house and say, hey, wake up the family animals. They're clearly living at that, just like David lived with the animals. He lived among them. He was the shepherd. Shepherd doesn't stop being a shepherd just because it's nighttime, right? And they placed him in a manger, and where the Magi, once again, came from Arabia and found him. Where is the source he's using for this? It could be, except this isn't found anywhere near there, except the cave reference. And that source also seemed to borrow from a common source that this text is from. 150. Protevangelium follows that. Now, so we have 2 pages of this. I took another section from Justin as well on Jesus and John the Baptist. He waited for 30 years, more or less, until John appeared before him as a herald of his arrival and preceded him in the way of baptism, as I have already shown. In fact, a very lengthy section is on John the Baptist and Justin Martyr. When Jesus then went to the river Jordan where John was baptizing and he stepped into the water, a fire was kindled in the Jordan. Where does that come from? I don't remember that in the New Testament. And yet here's the framer of Western theology, who claims he's using apostolic sources. And when he came out of the water, the Holy Spirit rested upon him like a dove, as the apostles of this very Christ of ours wrote. So he knows that they wrote it, but he's not quoting it. He's paraphrasing. Almost everybody paraphrases. They don't tell exactly the statement. And when you refer to a passage, generally you're giving a context that requires some sort of paraphrase. But he has the facts down as he knows them to be, but he's embellishing the area of expertise of his argument that forces the individuals to acknowledge the magi or acknowledge the cave or acknowledge the water on fire. And we know that he did not go to the river because he stood in need of baptism. Where's that coming from? Jesus didn't need to be baptized because he was already perfect. Where did that come from? In fact, I'm willing to say they all came from the same source. Again, the framer of Western theology, the one upon whom everybody is based in Greek. Descend on him like a dove and submitted to be born, to be crucified, but not because he needed these things, but because of humanity that from Adam had fallen under the power of death and the guile of the serpent, and each one had committed personal transgression. Also not in the New Testament, but from the same gospel source. When John remained near the Jordan and preached the baptism of repentance, wearing only a leathern girdle and a vesture made of camel's hair, eating nothing but locusts, wild honey, men supposed that he was the Christ, but he cried out to them, I am not the Christ. Now he has to denounce John because John was an incredibly famous character in history. You find him in Josephus, you find him in Eusebius, Jewish and Christian sources. But the voice of the one the voice of the one announcing, or calling in the wilderness, right? For he who is stronger than I, come, whose shoes I'm not willing or worthy to bear. When Jesus then came to the Jordan, he was considered the son of Joseph. Now that certainly isn't going to be something you find in the Protevangelium, but something you find in a gospel that isn't Matthew, Mark, or Luke. In fact, not Matthew or Luke, because Mark has no birth narrative at all either. It starts with John. And he was considered to be the son of Joseph, an artisan, one who appeared without beauty. This was a real important feature of early Christian thought. Jesus was not a looker, despite all the pictures we have. Jesus is not an attractive man. Why is that important in this story? Could be. It could be the suffering servant overlay. What else could it be? There's no comeliness. He's not a looker. He wasn't ugly either. He was Why is that important? How many evangelists on television does it take to make $1 million? That's right. He's not a looker trying to persuade you because he looks convincing. I mean, you always fall for the good-looking. I mean, come on. We all can name numerous pastors who have beautiful looks, but that doesn't mean the content out of their mouth has anything of value, right? Or, for that matter, the flim-flam man or insurance man or the person who's trying to sell you this brand new car that only his grandmother drove 12 hours a week, right? And here's the most interesting part of the whole statement about Jesus. He made plows and yokes by which he taught symbols of righteousness and an active life. Of course he did. Turn not your back on your plow, my yoke is easy. These are all agricultural references. In fact, as I've said many times, most of Jesus' audience were farmers. Farmers and fishers. The illiterate. So Jesus made plows and yokes. He was part of the agricultural community of his time. This makes perfect sense. Because when Jesus spoke about the different kinds of seeds that you sow, or the different kinds of trees that you pull up when they're rotten, or the way that weeds can affect your garden and that sort of thing, he speaks with someone with authority. He knows the technical jargon. He's not some wannabe coming into your culture to tell you. And he wouldn't, by the way, be talking to farmers anyway. They have no money. Jesus isn't about money. He's not about good looks. It's about a message. And sometimes we forget that Jesus doesn't look like the television resemblance of Jesus. Right? First of all, let's make it very clear. Jesus wouldn't have had long flowing hair. He was Jewish. The hair was kinky and it was cropped. Every Jewish man cropped his hair, and he had facial hair. So the whole round face would be there behind a beard. No flowing hair. You let the hair grow, it's going to be all out this way. It's not going to be coming down like all of our pictures. Jesus is Norwegian or Italian, and I know this to be the case because every picture shows this. And he has blue eyes no matter what. Because you don't want Jesus to be ugly, and you don't want him to look Semitic. Yeah, you don't want Jesus to look too Jewish, right? Middle Eastern in color at that, because he would have been seen very, very, well, your skin color is exactly the color of Jesus' skin. Hers. Yep. That's the skin color. That's the skin color. And except you had round eyes because they were prominent for their round eyes, the Jews were. And the eyes would have been brown, of course, because that was the standard for, I don't know of any reference to blue eyes in Jewish literature. And the hair would have been cropped, and Jesus was a rather short man. We know this from, I could be here all night talking about it. But so Jesus is not a good looker. He's not a bad looker, but not just average, everyday person that isn't going to sway you because of his good looks. His hair is cropped. He looks like everybody else, and he's short. And he was an expert in farm equipment. This makes good sense to me. Because when he spoke to these farmers, he knew exactly the terminology for seeds to use, for farm equipment to use. John?
Well, I'm just thinking of people. Daniel Webster was the great orator.
Yeah.
Ever seen a picture of him?
No. Yes.
He's a little tiny guy.
It's because back then we believed in rhetoric. We still taught rhetoric. We don't teach rhetoric any longer.
I mean, Moses had speech impediment.
Yep.
So wouldn't God tell Moses that I will talk through you?
Paul had a speech problem. A serious speech problem. Why does God keep choosing all these losers? Ugly people, bad to speak people.
If he's too good looking or too this, then everybody thinks.
You take the focus off of the message and you put it on the person. Jesus is not a personality cult. But then the Holy Spirit, for the sake of humanity, as I formerly stated, rested upon him in the form of the dove, and there came an instant from heaven, a voice like that of David, uttering the same words, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." That certainly isn't New Testament. Even though it's in the New Testament, that definitive statement of Jesus connected directly to David and my son, that's not what you see today in the gospel record. You see a voice from heaven, not David's overtones.
The other thing about it is that he's a nondescript type of person.
Yep.
And that was part of his presentation. I don't want you to talk about me doing these things.
At the arrest of Jesus, people didn't know what he looked like, so they had to use somebody to point him out. He blended in with the crowd. And he was a short man. In fact, I'm convinced of the story of Zacchaeus isn't about Zacchaeus being short at all. It's Jesus being short. I mean, you couldn't see him in a crowd. He was buried in the middle. Zacchaeus climbs a tree so he could see the guy in the middle. That makes way more sense to me to think that Zacchaeus was a short man, because it was Jesus that was being focused on here. Again, a short man. And everything we have about Jesus in early Christian history describes him as an uncomely man who was short in stature. Boy, that isn't quite the Jesus of Hollywood, is it? It's just not the Jesus of Hollywood. Thank heavens. Now, let's go again back to the very first frame.
How do you understand the quotation, this day have I begotten you?
Yeah, it is today, this day I've begotten you, but it isn't the Davidic phrase that he's using here. Here he's using David's authority, talking to a Jewish scholar to show that the same authority that was on David is now on Christ. That's not the emphasis in Matthew or Luke. Yeah. Anybody else? Now let's look at these again. I've highlighted in red the uniqueness of these passages, and then we'll get on with our discussion. Magi came from Arabia. Arabia is not mentioned in the text. The king was born in your country. So he's talking to an individual, trying to persuade him by using the your comment. Your people killed him, your people crucified him, and your people didn't benefit from resurrection. That's the your being used here. Okay? And Herod learned from the elders, not in the New Testament he didn't. He went to the scribes and scholars, not the elders. The elders would have told him to mind his own business, not the scribes. The elders were afraid, not the scribes. Go down to the bottom here. After worshiping the child, that's not quite what the New Testament says. They came to pay him homage, but not actually to worship. Now, is that a choice of translation? Every translation I looked at was worship.
In some languages, there's one word for both.
Right. And it could be, but even the finest nitpickers that I could see with Justin, and I've got everything on Justin, wouldn't do it. They wanted it to be worship, not paid homage to or acknowledged. It was actual worship. And it's used more than once. After worshiping the child in Bethlehem. Again, look at this. He wished to divorce his betrothed. It doesn't say in the New Testament anything like this. Either he's one or the other, but not put them together. So what kind of source is he using for a census taken in Judea? Not really. It's not Judea. It's the whole entire empire that's having a census, not just one region. The tribe of Judah that inhabited that region, there's no tribe of Judah. There's no tribal context any longer. It's been so dispersed. Roman garrisons are everywhere. Judea at this time had already become a province or a near province. Oh no, it's a Roman region. But he's mentioning it because he's talking to a Jew, wanting to say, your people, your people, your people, your Christ, your Christ, your Christ, you killed him. Because Joseph could not find lodging in that village. Wait. He got into the village, couldn't find any place, and then went outside of the village and found a cave? Or what's the sequence otherwise? Now, here's some problems with this. What do the angels tell the shepherds in the field? Fear not, the Lord is with thee, blah, blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, good Christmas card stuff. Right. What do they tell the shepherds to go do? Go to town and likewise pay homage to the child. He's born in Bethlehem. There's no doubt from the Gospels, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why would they tell him to go into town? Because this is what happens. The moment Mary, 9 months pregnant, about to deliver a baby, enters town, the first thing they're going to do is get the midwives to grab her in a house and put her in a place. The only reason that there was no room in the inn, because he'd made hotel reservations. The hotel reservations are not actually a hotel. They're in a friend's house. He would have written a letter in advance. I'm coming down. Please save a room, because every Jew had an extra room for travelers, and he's a relative, and he's from this region. So he's going to stay with the family. No one expects him to come down with a bride. No one expects him to come down with a pregnant woman by any means. So when he arrives on the scene, the 3-day journey probably took how many days with the pregnant woman? 9 months? Potty breaks alone will make you late. Right? So when he arrives and they see her, they're not going to send him out to a cave. No. Because where does it say in the Gospel of Luke that the Magi go? In the house in which he's staying. The house in which he's staying. Yes, ma'am.
There's two types of caves. There's caves that nature just produces,
Right.
and there's caves that are dug,
Right.
and for people to inhabit
Right.
along with their animals,
Right.
like church.
But in this case, it says he found a certain cave in that region because he couldn't find a place in town. It does sound to me like it was empty.
Well, I mean, it could be empty, yet it could have been a built cave,
It could have been.
and similar to a guest house.
Could be. But maybe not. Yeah, it could be. But that is the beauty of this conversation. How much do you really know about the birth of Christ? And how much do we really know about the family of Mary or the family of Joseph or the goings-on between these various characters?
I'm just thinking also where they say there's
means guest house.
necessarily, it could mean living space,
Living space, guest room, or part of a house reserved.
space in there where they live.
Every Jew of moderate or wealthy means had to have an extra room for traveling Jews because Jews hasn't remained kosher, so they'd live with other Jews. It's that room. It's that spare room. It's that spare room that you opened up to family.
There's some really interesting talks by Dr. Kenneth Bailey on this whole subject that are on video that you can watch, and he says the very same thing that you're saying right now. Friend's house, the main room actually did have mangers in them because they did have certain livestock kinds of things.
It would have been actually under the house. It's the entrance where the animals lived when you first walk in.
So it would be common to, in a Middle Eastern house to see a place where the animals were being kept, but mangers, and actually the manger is one of the better places to put a baby. But especially if the spare room is actually being occupied by another guest.
Yeah, but it wouldn't have been if they just held on a little bit longer because he reserved it. As for the flocks that were brought into the house, there's no mention of that in any other Christian document, not even this one. It just says a cave. We assume it's empty. But the livestock you bring in is the one that you milk, the one that you need the next morning for. You're not bringing in the whole flock. You're bringing in only those that are domestic animals that you're working with the family. The rest of it is for money. In fact, when you look at where the shepherds are and the sheep that they're watching, it's the same fields that David occupied because these were individual sheep used for sacrifice. So it's a very unique kind of sheep being used here. These aren't going to be domestic animals. These are sheep that are prized for sacrifice in the temple. And they found him in a manger, or placed him in a manger. In a cave, that may or may not make sense, depends how much you have to weave them together, but notice he has no problem with it as if it's already well known and already accepted. Some document preceded this and preceded the Protevangelium about the birth narrative, and we don't have it yet.
This doesn't talk about the star.
Nope. No, and there's a reason for that too. Justin is very careful to make sure that the Magi are worshiping Christ, not that the star that could be used for paganism would somehow be directing them. That Jesus plays the central figure. Because he's talking to Trypho, the Jew. It's a big debate. It's a very thick document in two settings where Justin meets up with Trypho and they argue everything. It's a really interesting read. Justin loses most of the time. Trypho is a pretty good arguer. Okay, now let's look at the next one. He waited 30 years. You don't find that in the New Testament. Not in this context. All this was when he's around 30, plus or minus. Now, why would they say plus or minus, more or less? What's important about being 30? At age 30, you can have a public ministry. You're an adult, but you're not an elder. You're an elder at 40. Jesus never reached the status of an elder. So he has legitimacy, what he's doing. He has the ability to draw the crowds if he wishes. When he stepped into the water. Now, there is a reference to this in a gospel we talked about earlier. In fact, the very first gospel we mentioned in this series was the gospel according to the Hebrews. And every single one of these anomalies belonged to that work. That's how prominent that text was. It defined the birth of Christ for Justin Martyr, the framer of Western theology. Every one of these references are there. And I mention this because it's so easy to get caught up in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke scenario that somehow they all got together and schemed what they'd go. No, they wrote independently with the data in their hands without trying to elaborate or trying to embellish or trying to, sensationalize anything. They wrote what they knew based upon the witnesses that they had. And Justin is using a source that isn't Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. He's using a source that the apostles also used, and the gospel according to the Hebrews was put in the mouth of Matthew. Hence the memoirs of the apostles. Now, I mention this because it is extremely important to see that even though we have this significant writer who's not using the gospel message, nothing here has offended you. It just fleshes out more detail, which is why he'd choose the gospel according to the Hebrews, this incredibly famous work at the time, than Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, which were, I wouldn't call them fledgling documents, but didn't have the circulation that this other gospel did because it predated them by 40 years or so, 30 or 40 years. More. An artisan isn't mentioned. Without beauty isn't mentioned. Plows and yokes isn't mentioned. The voice that David also uttered isn't mentioned. So it's all mentioned in the gospel according to the Hebrews. And this is the reason I want to talk about this. This is our last discussion on the gospels for now. And we've dealt with how we got them, who wrote them, how they differed from each other. And the one thing we can come back with certainty is that the gospel according to the Hebrews is at the core of early Christian development, and we don't even have a copy of it. And yet, this is the same one that Jerome says he translated into Greek and to Latin in order to make sure everybody had access to it. So the writer of the Vulgate, the authorized Latin form of the Bible, and Eusebius had a translation as well, the framer of Western Christian history. Both made copies, and both were heresy hunters. If there's anything heretical in that work, it wouldn't have been translated. He even called it, Epiphanius, who the next generation used as their source for his history, called it the fifth gospel. It was in such prominence by the 4th century. And we still don't have a copy of it, and yet it's the undergirding of the entire Nativity.
I used to think it's so strange we have so few little fragments.
Yeah.
It's such a great work in such acceptance, and these guys are trying to make their own copies.
Yep.
We've got nothing. We've got a few fragments.
I would love to find that work. I think it would shock us how much detail fleshes out the account to make say, oh my gosh, no wonder. Or maybe we'd find something about the cockcrow that we don't have to kind of connive and scheme and make plausible conjectures that could happen.
We've got the same problem with the death of Christ.
Right, which I just mentioned.
Some say it was a skull, they go to the skull. Others say it was somewhere else. We don't know because there's no real accuracy written about exactly where it was.
Not to mention that, but the footprints of Jesus are not going to be found because they're 20 feet below the surface. And if you go down another 20 feet, you find the streets of David. So this is a city that's been built up and built up and built up over time. So the idea of putting your feet where Jesus, placed his feet is pretty silly.
So what we're doing is avoiding having all these tourists coming to that spot, or that was the holiest spot of the world.
What bothers me about this whole thing isn't what it says, because the content's perfectly fine with me. I think it's brilliant. I think it's wonderful. That's great. It's the fact that some people will deny it simply because it isn't in the New Testament. Either is the word Trinity. Either is the doctrine of original sin. The two grand doctrines of the Western Church. Neither of them are in the New Testament. Neither of them. But we're going to keep on those by looking at here and looking at there and piecing it together. But they're not willing to piece together from authentic documents that circulated the story of Christ's own birth. Fascinating to me.
Now, these documents were all put someplace safe. We know how that goes. Or was it that they were destroyed on purpose?
No, they weren't destroyed on purpose. The 3 copies that Jerome knew, that's 3 full copies, and he said they're all the same. One came from the Nazarenes, which was a Jewish Christian sect that was on the fringe. Another came from the Library of Pamphilus, which we'll talk about in a 25,000 volumes of early Christian texts. And he loses that whole library to Diocletian, and then that which is not destroyed is still preserved for another 400 years or so. So this is the grandstanding, granddaddy of all texts and libraries. And so he has these other versions, and he says, the one I have is clean. I'm just going to produce it, because he found nothing heretical in it. And here's a heresy hunter. He wrote numerous works against so-and-so and against so-and-so. Justin Martyr wrote the most extensive work against Marcion, and he's quoting from the Gospels that are not in the New Testament. Something's wrong with the way we're using the Bible. We're worshiping the words rather than listening to its meaning. And that poses a huge problem for me. Because when you get into an argument with someone who speaks better than you do or has a larger vocabulary, you will always lose. Or someone who's better looking or has more charisma, you will always lose. Because they'll use the argument so famous, God's really blessed him. He must be a man of the Lord. Instead of it being, he's really handsome, people throw money at him. You go into any church and say Jesus was let's call him a homely man. You'll be kicked out because they want their Jesus to be X, Y, and Z. That's a problem for me. I want Jesus to be authentic, to match the culture, to look at the story and how it develops over time, and to realize that there's going to come a time when the embellishment is way beyond the pale and no longer reflects any tradition except the agenda of the writer to clarify, or the agenda of the writer to expand for his own theological purposes.
Said about that. My tenant is a reader, and he's totally into the Nativity and the Gnostic and all of that, and it's just so hard to talk.
Because he's narrow-minded. I'm not opposed to Gnosticism. If you know what Gnosticism is, you'll laugh it off. But we make Gnosticism a viable, it was a small, it had multiple sects, but these were small, erudite, know-it-all philosophers who were joining this, I wouldn't call it cult, but near cult. Yeah, it did. Everybody who's anybody wrote against the Gnostics. And you look at the Nag Hammadi documents, you think, really, for this? How could they fall for this? Because they were told in eloquent words by very smart, educated people the truth about Jesus. Isn't that what we've done all along? We listen to the eloquent, the one who has the degree, the one who has the ivory towers behind him. Again, not against any of that, because I belong to that.
Everybody's accountable to that. Everybody is really accountable to do all we can to nurture our own curiosity, check things out, because that's what Paul talked about, especially in the letter to the Galatians. It's about checking out for false spirits and false prophets.
But it's so hard to do that in an age where the Holy Spirit seems so very quiet.
I don't know, Brent. He uses you plenty in my life. So.
He used to convert whole cities.
And I'm thinking the Holy Spirit said this and that to me. He's alive.
No, I'm not denying that. It just seems to me, a comment I made a few weeks ago, that the church has a tendency to be anemic. And because it's anemic, it doesn't have the power. Like, this is just my gut feeling. I think this stuff is worth 150 people being here every time. But it's not what people want to hear. They want to feel that what they've been told their whole life is right. And when you're challenged at that, it shakes the foundations. You have to live it and then show others how to live it. And that's multi-generational. Anyway, my point is with this, because now we're going to deal with the document of the night. My point is, we've already admitted that the story of Jesus has a secondary and tertiary level that involves documents that either didn't survive, or were used as authority and didn't survive, or survived but in either fragmented forms or works that were redacted or changed in some way. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. Sure.
It talked about the 30 years before Jesus met John.
Right.
And what, do we know what he was doing? I'm assuming he was either practicing, preparing to go out and talk, or he was doing his farming and agriculture.
He was doing farming and agriculture. He made yokes and plows. And the reason I can say this is because when he goes back to his hometown, what do they say? This nobody is claiming what? We know he's a farmer. How come he can claim messianic? How can he have any messianic claim at all when we know him? We know his family, we know his brothers, we know his father and mother's name, we know his sisters. They're all living here. Why do you think Jesus moved out of Nazareth the year before his ministry? He moved to Capernaum in order to gather a crowd because everybody knew him in Nazareth. And what did Jesus say when they were going to kill him and throw him off the cliff? What is? They may have, but he sure got his disciples quickly from there. But what is it that, the moment that Jesus pushes their buttons and says, here it is in Isaiah, today this is fulfilled, what do they want to do? They want to kill him. They want to kill him.
Because he's not talking the stuff that they already understand.
Exactly. Or the way they've understood it seems awfully either very simplistic or doesn't match the consequences or circumstances required for their fulfillment.
Back to the simple image of Christ. Are you going to follow him into battle? That sort of thing. His stature.
There's not too many people I have met that I would go to war for. Alexander was charming. He was charming. What would it take for me? I don't know. And maybe it's because from a very early age, 16, 17, I was in the church fathers. And I had very high expectations. And what I got in church or what I got in seminary was so subpar to these great writers that they never even knew the names of. Last year, can I give you a quick example? Last year I was reviewed. We get reviewed every 3 years at the university. And if you don't pass your review, you get fired. It's that simple. And I didn't really care, frankly. I just didn't care. I don't get paid enough anyway to survive. So I decided, let's throw it at him. I knew who was going to evaluate me. They tell you that. And I knew his agenda, and I knew that my agenda and his were absolute ultimate polar. They're just the opposite sides. So I delivered a sermon in my class on the Didache. He'd never heard it before. He raved about it because he'd never heard it. He's the head of our department now. Never heard of the Didache his entire life. This is everywhere you go. I had the Didache under my belt in Greek by the time I was 18 because it was such an amazing, simple text that you could look at the interlinear, because I created interlinear because I didn't know Greek well enough, but I could create interlinear. My grandfather did. My grandfather, I was a lazy kid. I was a pretty lazy TV watching kid. And my grandfather, I'd idolized him. He was an amazing guy. Came over at age 21 from Norway and built up, not an empire, but built up a family, had 5 daughters. My mom is the middle of them. And he loved me. You know, he was just a super nice, short little oofta saying man, you know. And he said, come on, get in my car. I'm going to drive you down. Just get in the car. He drove me to a bookstore. He drove me to a bookstore, the Curious Bookshop, on the corner of Los Gatos Boulevard and Main in downtown Los Gatos. And he said, I want you to read this, this, this. And he pulled them off and bought them and gave them to me. The first book was the Didache. And I read the Didache saying, that's not for me. That's not for me. It's more of the do's and don'ts, until chapter 6. When it says, if you're able to do all this, you are perfect. If you cannot, that what you can do is that you should do. And I thought, this is the Christianity I was looking for. Live the maximum of my capacity for who I am today and not worry about tomorrow. Just make sure tomorrow is better than today. And I was...
I just wonder if you took your grandson today to a bookstore, what is the likelihood that you're going to find a Didache anywhere?
He found 3 remarkable texts. Another one was the Apostolic Fathers in English. And that hooked me. It absolutely hooked me. Yeah. No. No, when I went on TBN, the first show was on How We Got the Bible. That was cool. The second, that lasted a whole year, was on the Didache. And I got 6,000 letters a week. Because what is this? This is amazing. What is this? It's just the simplest possible Christian doctrine and practice called the Didache. I printed a book called Didache at the time. We sold 25,000 units just during that series alone. Yeah, it was a big seller. We don't have any left. It was a big seller because it was one of those remarkable texts that just fit the mold of the audience that was in the need of this text at the time. I bring it to your attention because I'm not sure my son could find works like that. He doesn't need to, though. He has a big library to work with. Yeah. I had the world's largest English collection of Apostolic Fathers. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
But you're proving something that I was thinking before you said all this about yourself. Okay, I just came back from a foreign country in Nova Scotia.
Right.
And
They knew him by name.
Okay, so he's standing out from amongst the farmers in one hand, as maybe a little sharper, a little more intelligent. There's a Greek city right just up the road that probably uses his services. So Greek might be a thing that his son was taught. I think this is just flat out jealousy in the part of the Nazareth.
It might be. There's certainly.
You think you're better than us.
Well, it certainly comes across this way. We know you. We've changed your diapers, and now you think you're whom?
Yeah.
Right? That's either jealousy or arrogance, and those are pretty akin. Yeah.
Besides, you were saying that James had a special, the brother of Jesus, also was well trained.
In Hegesippus says he was called holy from his mother's womb. That's just like Jesus. He was only the only second after Jesus, the only person in all early Christian literature that had that authority is James, without a doubt.
According to Bailey, what he says is there's a significant piece in it that we don't often know, and that is that each of the towns had some verses that they were founded upon, and one of the verses that was near and dear to the town of Nazareth had to do with conquering the enemies, and had to do with I can't exactly, but Jesus actually came directly in confrontation of those verses, and also he elevated two women in unity, so to speak.
I don't know how he could say that, and I'm not arguing. I'm just saying I don't know how it could when no one knows where Nazareth is. It's such a small town that the exit and entrance sign were on the same pole, right? It's super small. It had a synagogue, which means they had 10 men. That's all it takes to make a synagogue is 10 men. When Jerome went looking because he wanted to build a monastery, no one knew where it was. They said, we think it was over there. It's long lost. So I don't know. I don't know upon which. So we'll have to look that up.
I can give some information.
Okay.
The thing is, it's about de-Zionizing their tradition, because they expected him to get up and finish this key verse of the village in
Yeah.
the proper way. He didn't.
But there's no source that this ever happened.
He cuts it off, and it does often this.
Yeah.
So, Jesus had a brother Joseph.
He had 4 brothers
4 brothers.
named in the gospel narrative.
So, do they have fathers?
According to everybody in the early church until the 3rd century, all these boys are the offspring of Mary and Joseph.
And so, after Jesus was born, Joseph decided that he would have a conjugal relationship with?
The boys are all born after Jesus was born. Jesus was the elder son.
Right. And so, allegedly,
But Jesus's parents having sex after Jesus was born wouldn't stop the virgin birth.
no.
You know.
But, I mean, why couldn't it be that Joseph was indeed Jesus' father?
Well, I don't have a problem with that, except the doctrine of virgin birth has a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that because I don't know what he gains from this, because baptism is the same thing. It cleanses you out. It cleanses your sin. But for the doctrine of the virgin birth, I uphold it because it's in the Gospels. But I don't think it makes that much difference to the storyline. But I do think this notion that Jesus had brothers, well, they had brothers because Paul describes them in Galatians. And in Galatians 1 and also in Galatians 9 says they all travel with their wives. So they all, and we also know that the family of Jesus lived in Nazareth for at least 250 years because we find one last reference to the family of Jesus at that time. So we know a lot. We just don't put the pieces together for the public because the public doesn't want to hear it.
And then, since you were talking about wives, would it automatically be assumed that Jesus would have had to have had a wife because he was...
The reason I'm convinced Jesus didn't have a wife is because the scandal was he didn't have a wife. If he had a wife, it wouldn't be a scandal. The scandal was he didn't have a wife. That was a scandal. And they kept trying to put out that fire all the time because Jesus didn't have a wife. And the role that Mary Magdalene plays is so unique, but it's long after Jesus' ministry, and it's only 1 year in length. And even she's not mentioned after the book of Acts. I mean, she's written out of the storyline entirely. And if you go to the Gnostic text, like we were talking about earlier, oh yeah, she plays a very prominent role, and Jesus kisses her, etc. But he also kisses the disciples, and they even admit in the storyline that he kisses her the same way he kisses us. Well, he kisses a woman because he greets a woman. But to make the next jump that they were married poses a problem, because who else greets Jesus with a kiss? Judas. Does that mean he's married to Jesus too? I mean, this makes no sense to me. And the difference between kissing a woman and kissing a man, considering it's on the lower neck, not much. Right? Not much. In fact, you greeted each other with a holy kiss in every church. It was Athanasius who wrote, it's Athenagoras, who wrote at the close of the 2nd century, we're going to change this holy kiss because some of you guys are taking advantage of it. From now on, shake hands or whatever. They changed the holy kiss because people were falling into lust over it. Isn't that interesting? Now, we wouldn't dare talk about that in church. It's too sacred to think. Well, it's a human thing too. And the story of Mary Magdalene, which we'll talk about later on next year, is an amazing story, but we ignore the big part of it, which is the role she really played in the early church, which is far more significant, just like the role Mary plays. All right. Introductory notes to the Protevangelium. The early church experienced the torture and death of its founder, the struggle to develop a cogent message, the persecution and martyrdom of its members, the expansion and advance into uncharted regions, and the demise of most chief leaders within a generation of its origins. That would destroy any organization. Destroy any organization. Any one of these adversities could have destroyed its integrity, and yet it didn't. Every group that followed, if they had this adversity, was lost. Christianity did not. The unique strengths of the movement were the intensity of its lifestyle, the diversity of its members, and the certainty of its convictions. You didn't have to keep convincing these people like the mystery cults. You didn't have to keep convincing them that our message is the right one. You didn't have to do this. They experienced it every day. They saw the benefit of loving your neighbor in the same manner in which you want to be loved. No government decree or social objection could destroy that which had no reason to survive except the veracity of its cause. This was especially the case when there is no codified collection of Jesus' sayings or standard narrative to offer new converts. Instead, the apostles delivered the gospel verbally, and in their absence sent letters of instruction. They dispatched them to communities that each of them established. How do you manage a group like this? How would you control the fact that it's oral tradition being handed down from community to community where Jesus never visited? Well, that's exactly what Paul struggled with, didn't he? How do you keep them on track? Paul lived in Corinth for 16 months. The moment he leaves, they break up into 4 different groups. One of them, Paul. He writes 1 Corinthians saying, how could you do this to me? They abandoned him entirely after the letter. They thought it was rude. Paul struggled his entire life getting authority, because if you think Jesus was ugly, look at Paul. He was a terribly homely man. He also had a speech impediment. I mean, this is the issue. I mean, he described himself as weak in the flesh, but strong in the spirit. This movement should have failed, except it didn't. And it was the veracity of its message, the integrity of its people. The people who preserved the text were the same people who applied the text. By the close of the apostolic age, when coevally Rome sacked Jerusalem, these documents imbued with authority were preserved. Those documents were preserved. But they were few in number and limited in scope. You don't need a book to tell the story of Jesus. You don't need the book in order to tell the story of salvation. In fact, it's better not to have the book. What happens the moment you have it in paper? You have a Bible in front of you. What do you use it for? To confirm your understanding of the text. But isn't it much better for someone to describe it to you in person? when you could pass it down to people who have experienced the same background as this individual and see how that person has become fully involved and imbued in this message that he can't shake because it's a unique experience. Something divine is happening in a person's life. You can't get that out of the book. You get that from personal experience and from sharing it with people life. That's what kept the message going, even during times of persecution. However, by that time, additional treatises circulated that drew local censure, even though a few of them contained a fair amount of similar content. By the end of the century, a second generation of principal figures either faced execution or faded into memory with the advance of the Roman regime. Many of them likewise composed texts that were received with authority, while fewer apostolic writings were used to corroborate the message initially received. So eventually what we find is the New Testament not preserving the text, but proving the authenticity of the content of the next generation of documents. This was an era of heresy and schism. It didn't take long, less than a century, for Christianity to break into a gazillion parts. When diversity enabled various movements to redefine the message, that was the key to early Christian success. It had diversity. You didn't have to exactly think the same. You didn't have to exactly keep the same customs. Some people could drink alcohol, some people shouldn't drink alcohol. Some people should keep their jobs, other people should go out full-time ministry. It was a diversified group of people who didn't always get along. And case in point, Paul the Apostle, end of statement. Paul had as many enemies among the Christians as he did among the Jews. But you couldn't stop the veracity of his message. He may not have been very likable, but he was brilliant. And you couldn't deny it when you heard him speak it, even though it was very densely spoken and probably poorly pronounced. His message survived 2,000 years of history. On the fringe of the church were others who blended its content with philosophy or philosophic, pagan, speculative, or esoteric elements in order to develop incredibly disparate schools of thought, like the Gnostics. The reason I know Gnosticism isn't the original form of Christianity, the example I use in class is this. And forgive the sarcasm because it's going to be thick. In 1905, when the first Lamborghini came off the Ford plant, we've strived very hard to make the Model A this year's model. Sounds stupid, doesn't it? The Maserati is a considerably more unique car for its horsepower and status than the Model A. My dad had a Model A. I love that little thing, but you couldn't get it started half the time. He parked it on the hill to get it started because if all else failed, he could pop the clutch. That's the only way to get the thing started. Great car, fun to watch, but I wouldn't want to drive it to work every day, which he did because he loved it. I just find you'd have to be a tech genius in 2025 and talk to tech geniuses in 1994 and expect the language to converse evenly. These people aren't going to remember or hear anything from these people for another 25 years. Gnosticism was an esoteric, clever, meaty, cocky, arrogant tradition that made Jesus into the savior of a handful of people who were wise enough to catch the redemptive theory. That's not what I want. I want somebody next to me who's a garbage collector, and somebody next to me who's a professor at university. I want to hang out with people who actually can tell me how that rubber meets the road and that Model A will still work in a Maserati or Lamborghini era. Many of these communities likewise wrote extensively, and their works were disseminated throughout the empire, often disguised as authentic literary artifacts from revered founders. I mean, if you're going to write a book about Jesus, why not put an apostle's name to it? You're more likely, would you put your money in Brent's bank? Or the Poodle Shop and bank? No, you want Smith & Wesson Guaranteed, Chase and Citibank behind, right? I mean, you're not going to put your money in an arbitrary bank. You're going to put your money where you want it to be preserved. More make money for you. So if you're going to write a work that involves the 12 apostles, by all means, make an apostle the author. For example, legends circulated concerning Jesus and the 12 apostles, and by the close of the 2nd century, a host of erudite endeavors blended these into the historical record. these documents are called apocryphal. And these works that were blended, that were not authentic, blended with authentic works, are apocryphal. Now, most of them are harmless. Most of them are harmless. They just expand stories in order to make them like novels. But they're harmless in one respect. On the other side of that coin, they're terribly destructive because people will pick and choose what they like and leave behind the stuff they don't. And fantasy is way more interesting than reality. A term implying questionable authenticity or secret teaching is exclusive to a particular group that created it. In contrast, were canonical texts, those received as revealed, genuine, and universally acknowledged. In short, they were not hidden from the general public, which is what apocryphal literally means, but were open to interpretation as well as to application. That's what you don't find in Gnosticism. You don't find people saying, come join us, you'll get revealed these things. Oh no, it takes a lifetime, maybe multiple lifetimes to get there. So how do you know you're on the right track until you die? I want something a little more firm now. I want my heart, my body, my mind, my attitude, my aspirations, my dreams, all to line up around concepts that I can actually see somebody else applying that I find in my own life successful. One common appeal to authority in apocryphal literature, although not necessarily universally acknowledged, is that James is the brother of Jesus. There are very few things I can say with confidence as much as Jesus had a brother named James. You see this in the book of Acts. He takes the lead after the apostles leave. You can see him throughout Paul's epistles. Paul checks in with him every time he goes to Jerusalem. You can see that Peter and Paul, through James, are continually working different sides of the fence because they don't want to step into each other's ministry. It's James that is the first to introduce the Gentiles into the faith. It's him who writes the letter and sends it out in the name of the apostles. It's him who is a Nazarite, a holy man that the Jews never would have believed in a gazillion years that he was a renegade Christian because he didn't wear it on his sleeve. For the sake of preservation of the church, he remained a holy man. This is a man that every single early Christian writer said was nicknamed camel knees because his knees were like as rough as a camel for the number of hours he spent on his knees in prayer for Israel. I can go on all night with this man. A very unique character. And the only reason I mention it is because the document tonight is the Protevangelium, and James is the writer. Now, is it possible? Oh, heavens no. But if you're going to write a document and have it circulated, you're not going to put it in the name of Jesus. No one will believe you. You put it in the name of the most impressive character in New Testament history, who is James, the brother of Jesus. Not Paul. You won't like Paul. You'll love his writings, but you won't like him as a person. And Peter, very cool guy, has a great message, but doesn't have the meat that you'd find James providing in Jerusalem. He was the central figure in the Jewish Christian tradition. The Gospel according to the Hebrews, he plays this very prominent role. In fact, I mentioned a couple weeks ago that it was in the Gospel of Thomas when they asked Jesus, "You're going to leave us, where should we turn next?" He says, "Go to James for whom heaven and earth was created." That's a lot of praise for a guy named James.
That's in the
Gospel of Thomas. Where should we turn? Turn to James. So even the Gnostics loved him. The Gnostics loved him. The Christians loved him. The Judeo-Christian tradition loved him. He was the man to turn to. Christ replied that James the just would be the guy. I didn't even remember putting it in here. James is named the author of several sources in the apocryphal tradition. I mean, after all, he plays the leading role in Jerusalem. And this exhibits the unprecedented allure that generally characterized his persona. The death story of James is fascinating. A riot broke out because of Christians trying to convert people during the holy days. And the local chief priests approached James and say, "Go out there and chill it out. You're the holy man. They all know you." They don't know he's a Christian. And they tell him from the parapet of the temple, they tell him, scream down, you Christians are heretics, you Christians need to stop. Instead, he announced that Jesus was the Messiah, the long-awaited one, and they threw him off the parapet to his death. He didn't really die. He was stunned. They beat him to death with a fuller's club, which is a huge club he used to beat out the dirt of rugs. That's how he died. I know the story to be somewhat true because it's not just found in Eusebius, the church historian, but it's found in Josephus, the Jewish historian. The only Christian character mentioned in Josephus, the man who wrote the ultimate history of the Jews, is James, the brother of Jesus. No one had more credential. No one. So if you're going to write a work about Mary and her origin, James has got to be our author. And that's what this work is about. Who really was predating the gospel story as a character? No New Testament individual made a greater impact on the apocryphal literature with regard to authority. For while Jesus was transformed into a redeemer or a revealer, James remained consistent as a historical and sagacious figure. He was a sage, a holy man. This further indicates, by the way, it was in the Gospel according to the Hebrews, if you remember a few weeks ago, that Jesus meets with him after his resurrection before everybody else. And this is found in multiple traditions outside this work, because they all are quoting the Gospel according to the Hebrews. James says, I will not eat or drink until my brother is resurrected from the dead. And Jesus appears and says, here's some bread, here's some wine, drink it. Right? Or that can't be wine, it has to be water, because he's a Nazarite. The point, he can't drink alcohol. The point is, Jesus appears only in that Gospel, and yet the tradition of that storyline was repeated again and again for 5 centuries. 5 centuries. Until finally the Dark Ages emerge. The church begins to sanitize everything, remove things that don't match the theological conundrum that they're after, and just boot it all out and call it heresy. This further indicates the respect garnered him from most movements and sects. He was the only one that the Christians and the Jews could respect, only one that Christians from the fringe, like the Ebionites or the Christians who were apostolic, could also admire. The only one who could pull this off. The only one that could pull, after the apostles all leave, pull the church out of this most hated group into one of the most beloved, because he was the leader of this group underground. Therefore, it is not entirely surprising that James was written into this kind of theological innovation as a principal founder of the Jewish Christian factions that emerged after the fall of Jerusalem. The document that began the process of James and his authority is the Protevangelium, an infancy narrative that redefined his role and transitioned his legend into history. Most reliable information about the birth and childhood of Jesus is derived from the canonical accounts. However, some infancy accounts circulated with the purpose to augment the original story with local legends or sectarian predispositions. As a result, details provided in the biblical narratives were embellished with apocryphal lore during the first 3 centuries of the church. By that time, diverse opinions concerning the role of the Virgin redefined her function, especially with regard to identifying the brothers of Jesus. 2 schools of thought developed. One affirmed that these sons were those of Joseph and Mary. The other asserts that Joseph was a widower from a former time, and these kids are from his wife, who's now dead. We don't have any story in the New Testament that Joseph is an old man. But let's assume this for a moment. Let's assume that Joseph was 20 years of age when he got married. Let's assume that the boys had grown and had families. Joseph would be 51 or so by the death of Christ. He'd already be dead. Most artisans were dead by 50. Their hard life. They're dead by 50. So even the New Testament can't tell you what happens to him. He's written out of the story because he simply doesn't exist. The Gospels really cover 1 year period of Jesus' life, and Joseph isn't present. The brothers of Jesus are present, but not Joseph. There is no allusion in the biblical record to indicate that any other relationship than full brothers is indicated. And there is no hint of a former wife of Joseph or his advanced age in these traditions. There's no reason for his advanced age because he's written out of the storyline anyway, but in a work called Joseph the Carpenter, he's 111 years of age when he dies. That's the only way they could make his age so that all those boys could come from Mary after Jesus was born and after Mary was already 16 or 18 years of age. It's the only way they could make it happen. That seems like an awful lot of effort to redefine a character who has a very minimal role after the birth of Christ. In fact, to the contrary, the canonical Gospels indicate that they were the sons of Joseph and Mary, and the evidence for this conclusion was the local community of Nazareth. They admitted that Jesus has brothers and sisters. Is not his father so-and-so? Now, does that mean that Joseph was his father? He certainly acted as a father. Do you think Joseph went around telling people my wife delivered birth from the Holy Spirit? I bet you she didn't. I'll bet you she didn't. I'm not real confident I would have said that. Why would you go around saying something like that? Who's going to believe it? Joseph didn't believe it. Who's going to believe it? So the town didn't know. They were sent to Nazareth on purpose because no one would know who they were. No one could trace them down. Nobody could do anything about Jesus being born. Furthermore, Paul identified Jesus as the brother of Jesus, and he identified him as a pillar of the church. And he also stated that siblings of Christ traveled with their wives and spread the gospel message. Therefore, sources for the view that Mary was a perpetual virgin, which is what this gospel is all about, and that Joseph was an elderly widow with 4 sons and 2 daughters, at least two daughters, it just says sisters, plural, are not biblical, nor are they the products of the first century Christian movement. And I'm not saying they're not true, but they're not first century. Where do you draw your line? Justin Martyr in 150? Because he certainly employed that material. There is no theological scandal for Mary to have children after Jesus, for the doctrine of the virgin birth remains intact. This, by the way, is taken right from the reader. Those of you who are picking up the article, this is right out of it. All I've done is take an excerpt so that I can introduce it so that you'd want to read this text and benefit from it. But there's no theological scandal of Mary having extra kids, provided Jesus was born of a virgin. In the same respect, the community that contrived this alternative storyline must have also maintained some incentive to advance the status of the virgin and likely also celibacy. So those in favor of celibacy would have loved the Protevangelium because there's virgin birth everywhere on it. Even the mother of Mary has ambiguous language used about her birth because her husband's out in praying that they deliver a child when she gets pregnant. That seems awfully odd. Doesn't it sound like almost virgin birth? Because you have to imbue upon the mother the same qualities of the son. Whatever the rationale, such legends regarding Mary were widely acknowledged, and in some quarters of the church, by the close of the 2nd century, they were the dominant theme. Of the surviving documents written during this era, one in particular influenced 5 centuries of Marian tradition, with each successive premise layered upon the former. This account made a tremendous impression on the public yearning for a Marian exemplar, that is to say, someone women could look to and follow as an example, as well as a Christian alternative to the Greco-Roman deities extolling her virtues. And this influenced patristic literature and the councils that followed through the Middle Ages. It was called the Book of James, later renamed the Protevangelium, which means first gospel. The gospel that predates the other gospels because it's the story of Mary. It ends with John the Baptist and his father Zechariah in the temple. It just says the pre-gospel. Little is certain about the author or the place of composition. However, as stated, it was fictitiously attributed to the brother of Jesus. Based on its literary style and general misperceptions about daily life in first century Jerusalem, its infancy gospel was neither based on apostolic tradition nor on the recollections of any relative of Jesus. Doesn't make it any less influential. Doesn't make it any less influential. However, no other authority is cited for this collection of legends, and because it was fraudulently ascribed to James and was heavily dependent upon the synoptic birth narratives, it may be a product of sectarianism. There's a reason the author wanted to amplify these particular elements. Why would someone rewrite a story about Mary with such incredible detail, a very moving narrative, unless there were an absolute necessity for it? Something had to have happened for them to rewrite the narrative, birth narrative of Christ by first introducing it with Mary. I'm not trying to support the document. I just want to clarify that most works that really catch on, and there's dozens and dozens of manuscripts of this work that actually were preserved, more than Justin Martyr, more than Ignatius of Antioch. As a result, there's no evidence that the Protevangelium was intended for propaganda either. In fact, different intent must be sought from understanding its design and its purpose. Regardless, there is no denying the influence of its contents on later traditions regarding Joseph and Mary and the siblings of Jesus. This account, therefore, served many purposes simultaneously, even though its writer did not realize the impact of his storytelling machinations. Finally, some of its legends were drawn from oral or written sources, and others were presented from early Christian apostolic and apologetical literature like Justin Martyr. Having established its unique category as a religious historical novel, this would be a new genre, a religious historical novel. That's what this guy's writing. There's a reason he wants these works to be ingrained in history, because of something that's happened that's altered people's views of Mary. Its credibility is seriously compromised by the fact that the author was ignorant of the geography of Palestine as well as the customs and practices of the province, but that's not going to matter to these readers. Anybody that's looking for a story of Mary isn't going to care about how accurate things are, right? I mean, look how long we've gone thinking Jesus was an Italian. Didn't change Christianity any, because we all know he's Norwegian. Its depiction of Jerusalem suggests a date well after the city's destruction, and its description of the temple and its function is not the product of Jewish authorship. This guy knew nothing about Judaism and knew nothing about the life in the geography of the Jews or life in first century Jerusalem. The two most commonly assigned places of origin are Egypt and Syria. And since the work gained popularity in both these locations, it's impossible to determine. I'll give you a theory in a moment. It seems certain that the document dates from the middle of the 2nd century because it was known to Clement of Alexandria and also to Origen. No one was more fond of tradition than Origen. But there is no evidence of anything earlier. So that means by the mid-2nd century, the earliest references we have to the Protevangelium are already in circulation in someone who lived after the time it was written. While some of the extra canonical legends that Justin maintained that I talked about earlier are also found in the Protevangelium, it does not mean that he followed it. In fact, he followed the Gospel according to the Hebrews, a text that both used. Again, the Protevangelium borrows from the Gospel of the Hebrews just like it does Matthew and Luke. It uses the three main narratives for the Nativity. The author wrote from Mary's perspective, although in third person, and her birth narrative is also included. In fact, it became the basis for all stages of the storyline, including the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, is based on this document. All that artwork you see of Mary being raised in the temple, in this work. Because in this gospel only is Mary raised in the temple until she's 2 years of age. For the first time in literature, she's portrayed as the daughter of a rich Jewish man named Joachim and his wife Anna. They were old and childless. These are childless. These are exactly the names in Catholic tradition of the Marian family. Where did they get it? Protevangelium. All 7 stages of Mary's advance from being born through almost miraculous means from a woman who's barren to her ascent into heaven, sitting next to Christ, all are based on this gospel. That's why there's so many manuscripts of it. Throughout the account, there are several reminiscences of Abraham and from the Abraham and Sarah saga, albeit sometimes quite subtle. They were also barren and yet established the covenantal framework for Jewish aspiration and identity. The birth of Mary, however, similarly seems to be loosely based on the story of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, the prophet, who was raised in the temple. Another virtuous woman directing a new age of a covenantal people. One day she went to the temple to plead her case for the Lord, and Eli, the high priest, was sitting at the door. Hannah asked for a son, and in return she vowed to give the child back to God for service as a priest, or a promise that it would remain a lifelong Nazirite. She bore a son, consequently nurtured the infant, and this is what we get for the story of Samuel. So these are very intriguing storylines that interlope, and the reason they do on purpose is because the writer recognizes the readers are going to see that connection. So it can be said very, very quietly. Now, okay. Let me give you my conclusion. I'm convinced that this document was written because rumors spread about Mary that were just impossible to denounce. I mean, after all, it is a hard sell saying Mary delivered a child without a man. Hard sell. Not too many people are going to buy it. But what do you do when Mary is called a slut? That's about what happens. They call her a slut. In fact, the Jews have certain words they use for her that show that she's less than honorable as a woman, a tramp. Certainly that would have been the storyline of Trypho if Justin had approached it, but he didn't. And to prove this to you, in the book of Sanhedrin, which is in the Babylonian Talmud, our rabbis taught that Jesus, the Nazarene, had 5 disciples, and here's their names. The master said Jesus of Nazareth practiced magic, deceived, and led Israel astray. On the eve of Passover, Jesus the Nazarene was hanged by a rope, and a herald went forth for 40 days announcing Jesus the Nazarene is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, as well as instigated and seduced Israel into idolatry. Whoever knows anything in his defense may come and state it. Yeah, that ever happened. However, since they did not find anyone in his defense, they hanged him on the eve of Passover. Not quite the storyline you get in the New Testament. While no Talmudic passage states that Mary was his mother, Jesus is occasionally called the son of Pandera, her lover. He also is identified as the son of Stata, as well as that of Pandera, and many allusions insinuate that Mary committed adultery. Well, Joseph thought that. So the only reason to look at the Talmud or to look at Jewish references is to see what might have been circulated about Jesus or about Mary that needed to be corrected. There was a document written around 175. It was by a man named Celsus. He lived in Alexandria. And Celsus wrote a work called The True Word, in which he describes the truth about the birth of Jesus, that Mary slept around, got pregnant. They covered it with this story. She's just a common tramp. And therefore, nothing about Christianity can be true if the foundation is lost. This is pretty scandalous, especially since Celsus is not just a critic, but a very influential character in the city of Alexandria, which is where this work first appears, in Clement of Alexandria. Where does he say he heard these rumors? He says, I heard them after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is when is the Bar Kokhba revolt? 122 to 26. So that's 50 years before this work is published. Where do you hear it? From the Jews who had access to the storyline. My guess is this. Celsus is in Alexandria, preaching against Christianity, calls them all the names necessary. Some local priest or activist wants to correct the record. He wants to do so in such a thorough manner as to make sure every single T is crossed and every single I is dotted. because it's redundant throughout. Not only did that happen, but he was here and he was here and he was here and here. They're all there. They all saw it. You can't deny everybody. Throughout the work, you get this layering of witnesses, layering of witnesses, layering of witnesses. He wasn't even in town that week when it happened, which is exactly the story of Joachim. He wasn't even in town when his wife got pregnant. In fact, when Joseph takes Mary out of Jerusalem to go hide in Nazareth, he's out for 40 days building, not knowing that he's an artisan, not building houses. He's going to be building farm equipment, but nonetheless, he doesn't even know Jesus' storyline. But he goes as far as to say he's not even home when she conceives. She thinks that he's left her. It's just amazing. This is a document that was meant to defend the church. To defend the church against the scathing comments against Mary that were undermining the entire gospel message, which was Jesus was born of a virgin, and that purity was part of the salvation and redemption of humanity. And I find very little wrong with the intent. But I wish he'd used authentic sources. It would have been a much cleaner document. But he didn't have it at his fingertips. He's living in Alexandria. Christianity in Alexandria didn't really start until about 170. So Christianity was kind of a nascent tradition at the time. Well, there's my talk for tonight. They love the Protevangelium. Oh, they love the Protevangelium. Look at the artwork that this work has produced. I mean, every single picture you see of Mary is based on the Protevangelium. Every one. Because most of them are her Annunciation, her Annunciation at the temple, the Immaculate Conception, the ascent of Mary into heaven, her raised in the temple. All these are major themes throughout the Middle Ages, and all of them borrowed from this one work. And the only reason I wanted to bring it to your attention is this work is so incredibly foundational. It's so incredibly important that it shouldn't be denied in churches for people to talk about. But the reason it isn't is because it might say something wrong. Well, we're announcing that up front. How could people buy something that was wrong? Why weren't they given the authentic message in a manner that didn't need them to go stray and look for some fairy tale instead? We're taking a week off because we do this 4 times a month, so you get a week off. When we come back, I'm going to talk about the Oxyrhynchus papyri, Grenfell and Hunt. What things have we discovered like this work? We're going to talk about the great manuscript that Berenius found that had the Didache in it. All that on the very first lecture. What did we find in the last 100 years that will shake your shoes and make you think again about how much you don't know about early Christian history, because this stuff has only been published in the last 50 years. Including the Nag Hammadi documents, which are all Gnostic, they'll also be mentioned in detail. I'll see you then.